Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's class. Can you hear me?
Not so clearly, Winnie.
Okay. Is that a bit better now?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, so welcome everyone to today's session. We will start right away. Our guest is here already. And so before we begin, we want to invite Herma. Please start with a word of invocation or a word of encouragement to us before we can start the class today. So Herma, please go ahead.
Good evening, good morning, sisters. Are you getting me? Yes?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good morning, good evening, sisters. Thank God we are meeting again this week. And I'm going to pray. Let us pray. Our Heavenly Father, we come unto you this afternoon. We give you glory and honor as we are going to start our session. Be with us until the end. I pray and believe. Amen.
Thank you, Herma, for that. Sorry, I'm changing positions because of my network today. So just give me a moment. Okay, so welcome, sisters, again. I will welcome our guest and who has been a friend to the school and has always accepted our invitation to come and speak to all of us. And so before we speak, before I invite her to speak, I'm going to read her bio. Sorry, I'm breathing out because I was moving. So Edna Kaptor is a social development specialist, Indigenous people's rights and climate gender justice advocate. She has a focus on environmental governance, human and Indigenous rights, and projects and policy for over 15 years. Mrs. Kaptor is passionate about sustainable development and the promotion of interdisciplinary approaches to capacity development, project design, and project implementation and policy. She supports global grant making and partnerships at Pawanka Fund. Pawanka Fund is a global Indigenous-led fund that is working to change the way philanthropy is done, guided by Indigenous values of reciprocity, Indigenous governance, body composed by leaders from around the globe. So thank you so much, Edna, for gracing us with your presence and for coming to share your knowledge and your experience with us. And so welcome. You have, for your time, please feel free to contract the session at will. If you need any assistance or any, if you require anything from us or the FEMI team, we are ready to help you during this time. So thank you so much again and welcome.
Thank you, Winnie, and thank you to FEMI for having me here. I hope you can catch me clearly. I have a cold, unfortunately, but thank you for extending the invitation to share my little knowledge with other Indigenous sisters. Please, interpreters, let me know when I'm too fast. Unfortunately, I speak too fast sometimes, and it's not easy to catch up. So please let me know. Also, at any point, our Indigenous sisters from the Leadership School, if you need any clarification, you can stop me at any point, but we can try to make it interactive as well. So feel free to reach out and ask any question or stop me if you need clarity. So I'll start with sharing with you about global processes that are important. Please note, these are processes that are not, I wouldn't say exhaustive of all the processes that are existing globally, that our respective governments, whether from Asia, the Pacific region, or Africa, are engaged in. So I'm going to touch on the 3 Clio conventions and also to elaborate on the forms of participation for Indigenous women and, of course, how Indigenous people engage. I'll touch on the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, the UN Convention on Climate Change, and the Convention to Combat Desertification, as well as touch briefly on the Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, which has 3 conventions under it. So please don't be overwhelmed with the information. I've engaged for some years. There are people who've engaged with this convention for more than 20 years, but still it's a learning process, because as conventions, they keep changing, new agreements come into place, new measures, because as a globally, even at country level, everything is evolving. And so new measure strategies usually come into place. And so they keep changing. And to understand this convention, one needs time and time to read, and also to follow what decisions have been made before, and also to understand at your country level what is happening, because you need to link the global to the local. And so it takes time. You can't learn about it today and think, oh, I'm conversant. I myself am learning about the way these conventions are evolving. And also another information to be aware of, you can't you hardly can be able to engage in all this convention process. It takes time, it requires a lot of resources and also commitment. So sometimes you find someone following religiously the Convention on Biological Diversity and maybe a little bit on climate change, or they just follow on desertification. They're related, but you have to prioritize because of resource limit and also the time that these conventions require. And basically, since 1992, previously, governments have been meeting, of course, under the auspices of the United Nations, and they've been talking a lot on different issues they are facing. But in 1992, one conference called the Conference on Environment and Development, which was held in Brazil and branded the Rio Conference, was held because countries realized the way they are developing, they need to come to a position where they're able to design instruments to guide their development so that they don't compromise future generations' well-being, because they're being impacted by climate change, biodiversity is also diminishing. And so they decided to tackle it because it was a global issue. Those from North America, Africa, Asia, Pacific, Latin America, saw it as a challenge. And so this process in 1992 gave birth to 3 conventions. And these conventions are supposed really to set out the general norms of how countries can behave to handle climate change issues, biodiversity issues. And so they are an important element for you to understand in terms of the global policy space, because you need to know, why does the convention exist? what's the history behind it? What object does it entail in terms of what it wants to achieve, and so when are they convened, and many other more. And so conventions is not that complex, but it needs time to understand. So I'm going to touch on those 3 conventions and a bit on the other convention on persistent organic pollutants, and so that you can have an idea and also dedicate your time as well to go and start reading and to understand all these processes. So basically, before I start, I'd like to ask our participants, and maybe Winnie and Joy, you could help as well in terms of, I can call out the name if no one volunteers. I want to know, when you hear about biological diversity, or what they call it in short, biodiversity, what comes to mind? Any volunteers? I see people here I could call out. I see Anima.
Hi, good evening. According to me, I'm not sure. Biological diversity, does it mean like you know difference in different territorial region? Like my place, I'm from the indigenous community, so uh, biological diversity, is it to do something with the plants or something like that? I'm not sure.
Thank you, Anima. Yes, yes, Anima is from Asia. I see Maria, the Titoya, I think from Kenya. You can tell from the name. And please note, I know some of you from I know your organizations, and some I know personally, so at least I could be able to call you out as well. And you come from interesting organizations and networks, so please feel free. I see Maria. What do you understand by biodiversity? Just from your own understanding.
Okay, thank you. What comes to my mind is the different variety of species like plants and animals that is found in our ecosystems. Thank you.
Thank you. I think from Latin America, I see Sitlali. Can you hear us, Sitlali? What do you understand by biodiversity? Or maybe if Sitlali can't hear, I know from the Pacific, there's Yobon. What do you understand by biodiversity? Winnie, I hope I'm clear. I can be heard.
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you, Sister.
Yes, you are. There's someone who has their hand up.
Okay.
Siham has her hand up, so she can perhaps speak before Sitlali and Shibon can come to the mic.
Sure.
I think it's the different
Siham, please
life.
go ahead.
There. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think it's the different life of on the earth. It's kind of different ecosystem of life. Like for example, the animals' life, the plants' life, the human beings' life, every life on the earth. I think this has come to my mind.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Siham. I see Pema, Anima, Maria, and all that you've written also in the chat in terms of what you understand by biodiversity, and it's correct. Biodiversity relates to all life forms on this planet, so it touches on plants, all life forms, plants, animals, and so you are correct. And of course, you'll find it in one area, so and sometimes in others. And there are variety, even fungi, microorganisms, bacteria, all of those form part, and they are found in ecosystems. So I know maybe those from the Pacific, you are living maybe in the coastal, there are those living in the drylands, those living in, let's say, mountain areas, and all these have different and variety, diversity, and you put it so well. So in short, they say biodiversity, so in full, it's biological diversity, and there are regions that are considered with a lot of biodiversity, so they are called mega diverse, and there are those that are considered really not mega diverse, but have rich biodiversity. And most areas considered rich in biodiversity are in indigenous territory, and that's why this convention is important. And of course, with it, there's knowledge that is linked to the convention. So another question to other participants who haven't shared or spoken as well is what are in your area, you have the forest ecosystem, you have your waters, those living in drylands. What are the current challenges you see that you're facing within those ecosystems? Any volunteers? Or yeah, I see Doris. Please go ahead.
Yes, here in the Philippines, one of the main problems that is seen in terms of biodiversity is biodiversity loss because of many, like for instance, because of monocropping, because of different damaging ways that we are using our land. So because also of extractive industries that are entering our ancestral lands. So biodiversity loss, and also landslides and all that, natural disasters that are exacerbated by this biodiversity loss. Thank you.
Thank you, Doris. Very well put. Anima?
Here in our state, the recent problem or the issues are actually the landslide and the earthquake happening because of gas. Gas is being taken out from under the ground, and especially from the indigenous area, which is interior. So because of which there is a gap under the land, and that helps in the earthquake, and affecting the I think the land part, that is affecting a lot.
Thank you. I see Brittany.
Sí, hermana, buenos días, hermanas con todos, buenos días.
Yes, good morning. Here in Peru, around the area of Puno, we're seeing a biodiversity problem related to fish. In the Lake Titicaca area, before we had fish of different names that no longer exist. They're becoming extinct. And that's because of the excessive cultivation of trout. Now there's trout fisheries, and trouts are carnivorous, and they are eating the other fish. And so as they try to raise trout, they're devouring other species, so we have fewer species. And there are other species that help keep the ecosystem balanced and are very nutritional. But so the trout industry is artificial, but it's taking over our native fish. And in terms of plants also, we're having challenges with our medicinal plants because they're starting to disappear because of pollution and other things. I'm not sure why, but we used to have a lot of medicinal plants that came from certain areas. but now we can only find them by traveling long distances. That's all.
Gracias, Bethany. Jonali?
Buenos días. Una de las situaciones
Good
que
morning. One of the situations that we're facing
al desgaste de la naturaleza
in terms of
la tala de
loss of nature here in Nicaragua is logging. Also,
la extracción de las riquezas marítimas como
extraction of maritime wealth. So lobsters,
del mar que las exportan
sea cucumbers that are exported.
contaminación del agua.
And so all of this also pollutes the water. Mining is also a problem because mining is contaminating our water.
A que muchos
And
de los árboles
that means that many trees are not able to grow either, especially because we have a situation of excessive logging.
por el desastre natural
And we've also had some
de Nicaragua.
natural disasters here in our region in Nicaragua.
3 huracanes.
We've had 3 hurricanes, which unfortunately have led to a lot of our forest, loss of our forest lands as well. Thank you.
Gracias, mi amigas. And
Thank
thank you
you,
for the
friends.
feedback. It's been interesting to see you all have an understanding of the biodiversity issues that are facing your community. A number I've seen also in the chat, really looking at the extractive ones and so forth. And you're right, biodiversity is rich on Earth, but it's facing a lot of pressure from overconsumption, demands from urban areas, for instance, from the corporates, and of course, there is challenge with the way this production is done and the way consumption, there's no balance. And so we find that there's a lot of extraction in the areas. So you find that demands from companies that need maybe logs and wood to make paper. So there's a lot of extraction, or they need oil production companies. So they do, I saw someone from Indonesia highlighting the oil palm plantations, or those demands for monocropping. And so faced also with the challenge that we don't have good governance, and our countries are driven by economy to make money for the country. So this continue to manifest. And so the community forests, the waters, as well, industrial agriculture, all these place pressure on the biodiversity, and of course degradation happens. And even though there's income from this biodiversity, communities that are custodians of this biodiversity don't benefit, don't get a share. And so there's an equal distribution of these benefits of arising from this. And the challenge for community as well, it involves their practice and their traditional knowledge, and this also is impacted. You've touched on threats on invasive alien species that of course come into our lands, and of course the pollution. When they do mining, it ends up in the water ecosystem. One of you have touched about prolonged drought, that's a climate change. So coupled with these pressures, and then also these other threats that come in, like invasive species, the pollution, impacts of climate change, like you have this landslide, the flooding, the drought. So our biodiversity faces a lot of pressure, and this has been there since a long time, even before many of us were born, and it's still continuing. And so this is what triggered biodiversity convention to come into place. And of course, the biodiversity itself, the process started way before 1992, when parties came together, our governments in Brazil. Already scientists who are called Working Group of Experts had sat and come up with with the paper that showed really biodiversity is facing a big threat, and if people continue the way they're doing in terms of how they consume, produce, and also manage biodiversity, then future generation will be at a loss. And so biodiversity convention really is there to address a number of issues, to really support countries so that they're able to conserve biodiversity, ensure its conservation, and ensure that it's used sustainably, and of course also allow that when they are used and biodiversity from an area is used, that any benefit arising from it, whether monetary or other forms, for using these resources, communities are able to get equal share. We know that's a challenge, but then also to govern how this sharing and also how biodiversity also can be managed. Different protocols came into place because, you know, it's considered a hazard. If I move my biodiversity, that's why we have invasive species. If I bring a plant from Indonesia to Kenya, that's considered different and it's invasion. You know? And so because it's not used to this ecosystem, and it might manifest differently, and we've had those experiences. As well, we have cases where biodiversity, even for instance, a local sheep, for instance, in Kenya, was found to be resistant to drought, and its gene was taken to Australia. And you see, there wasn't any protocol, managing that, and Kenya lost out because Australia did not pay them, because that's a gene found in Kenya, in the Kenyan sheep. In South Africa, also, there was a plant for community called Hoodia. And so community using that particular kind of plant, the San people are hunter-gatherers. And so they can go for many days without eating because the Hoodia plant makes them not want food and you feel full. And so manufacturing companies, especially in the pharmaceutical, saw an opportunity and took it and made pill, you know, slimming pill out of it. And so you see, and community did not benefit, and it was a long battle. So there are many, many cases where community are losing out. And so different protocol came into place. We have Nagoya protocol that really governs how benefit sharing should be done, and also a biosafety one, and also access and benefit sharing arrangements at national level. Each country is supposed to control how biodiversity is moved from its country, and also the certification. So do not worry about all this structure, but usually with these processes, when you talk about conditional or biological biodiversity, we have something which is a supreme body that makes decision. It's called the Conference of Parties. And this is just country governments who have signed onto the biodiversity process. And they signed onto it, and they are so they're considered parties to it. And so they come up with something called the Conference of Parties, which is where they meet for biodiversity processes every 2 years to discuss about decisions, how countries have progressed, and areas where they need to improve. And so far, 15 conferences have been held. The recent one was just last year, December, in Canada. And so it takes every 2 years, and the next one will be 16th. I haven't checked where it will be held, but it takes place every 2 years. And so all these process, like the biodiversity process, has bodies as well under it, where also it's represented by government. And these bodies are supposed to provide recommendation to their government, because also participating there is indigenous people, other NGOs, you know, other scientific organizations, even universities, other international organizations, where they're able to share about the work they do, and also the challenges biodiversity is facing and how it can be addressed. And under it, they've sectioned the work into different thematic areas that the Secretariat supports the different parties to report on, and also guide and create a program of work. So they have the agriculture biodiversity as a program of work. So it's important as Indigenous women, please go to the website, check what under agriculture or dry and subhumid land or forest, what is the program of work that is there, even though we know now they are working on a new biodiversity framework. You have to check and see what are the different issues that are being tackled that address, touch on forestry, touch on waters, mountain biodiversity for those who come from the mountain areas. So it's important. And please note, they make decisions and come up with the convention at the higher level, but at the local level, you have a person who usually it's from the Ministry of Environment, who are actually mandated to provide information to the government, and also the one to sit and negotiate and also address other issues. And usually it's important to know who's your national focal point in your respective country, what processes are taking place, because the national focal office does communicate their period of time where they're requested to report nationally to the Convention on Biological Diversity to show what strategies are being taken to address biodiversity challenges within the country. And a bigger component of the area, even with the new framework that is coming into place, is that now we'll have opportunity to also engage with our governments to influence the national biodiversity framework that they'll create, since the other one ended. They've had a number of them, but they already finished. So it's important to engage in such processes and to know. And just to say, for the participants here, hope you haven't seen. I know a number of you are here and you understand the biodiversity issues. And why do you think it's important really for Indigenous people to engage in such processes? Why do you think it's important? We haven't heard from Pacific. Why do you think it's important to know about the Convention on Biological Diversity?
I will say that from my perspective in Guam, in the Pacific, so much of our environment has been impacted, or at least for Guam, by the US military. And militarization has been probably the #1 contributor to a lot of our habitat loss, our species loss, and even just currently the organization that I'm with is organizing to protect our primary source of water, because mass deforestation over this area in the northern part of my island, the military is building a firing range complex, and they destroyed kind of an entire ecosystem of limestone forest that sits on top of this aquifer, which is a really large well beneath the soil that provides water for an entire island. And currently we're kind of seeing that if our government doesn't do anything to stop this, in about a year when the military starts working on this firing range, there's a really high possibility that our Guam's only water source will have to be dealing with lead contamination. And then these limestone forests are thousands of years old and they don't grow back. And so just even in the past decade or half a decade, the military has kind of rapidly just destroyed a lot of the ancient ecosystems that have sustained our island since our people have been here. And then in general, if you just think of the downwinders from the Marshall Islands who had to recover from nuclear testing, even in Guam, Guam is one of the most highly contaminated military sites in the world. We have, I think, we have the highest number of Superfund sites that weren't properly cleaned up. And so for me, when I think of the importance of this UN convention, I think of just the immense damage and the human rights issues that are connected to not having access to a clean and safe environment, especially for being such a small island and having nowhere to go. I think a lot of the reasons why our people have gotten just having high rates of cancer and high rates of even just like food security issues on top of that. It's all connected to the land and being dispossessed from that land. And I think when it's really clear within this convention, when Indigenous people aren't in control of their resources, it rapidly becomes very dangerous for the rest of the people living where they live. So yeah, I didn't know about this convention before today, or the specific kind of things that this convention addresses, but it's definitely very relevant to what's happening in my side of the world.
You, Siobhan, you put it so well, and yeah, it's important for its importance for your people, and I think all our lives, you know, and for Indigenous people, we have a lot of dependence on biodiversity for medicine. You know, it's your kitchen, it's your hospital, it's where also Indigenous people continue to strengthen their culture and practice their knowledge, and also some places, also biodiversity areas, are also sacred for communities. And even though they are facing challenges, Indigenous peoples also have very critical knowledge, and also are valuable in terms of providing solutions to address these challenges. I know there are a lot of human rights issues attached to really these biodiversity areas, and that has been a biggest challenge in terms of having it more reflected in the new biodiversity framework that are being discussed. So I see also comments coming in the chat area. I'll look at them, and you've put it so well. It's because of our dependence, and also how we also conserve can be replicated widely. And of course, Indigenous people have a lot to teach the world on how biodiversity can be conserved. So initially, to handle issues of biodiversity, the convention came up with action plans and also program of work. But more importantly, it came up with a strategic plan on biodiversity, which was supposed to go for 10 years, so from 2011 to 2020. And there were specific targets that governments were supposed to address to take actions really to stop these losses that were being faced in various areas globally. And each country was supposed to come up with what we call the National Biodiversity Strategic Action Plan. Some countries came up with them, some didn't. For instance, my country, Kenya, had one from 1992, but they did not ever review it, or even they reviewed, but they never issued a new action plan. But please note, each country also has sectoral policy. You'll have a water policy, you'll have a water strategy within your country, for instance, or specific one tackling forests. So all of those are supposed to be under one, because they're all handling biodiversity issues. But the 10-year mark came to an end, and after coming to an end, a lot of evaluation feedback was not nice. It showed that countries did not really tackle what they said they were going to tackle. That they did, one areas I've picked out only for Indigenous people, it says it did not engage Indigenous people on the ground implementation. I know there were a number of targets that talked about traditional knowledge, inclusion in really, and strengthening that within the national level, so that they can support communities to continue conserving biodiversity, issues about really engaging community fully and effectively, ensuring they participate in biodiversity policy making and also action. But a lot of communities were really implementing initiatives at their level, but that was not captured or supported by government. Also, that traditional knowledge was not really given the space it needed and the recognition. So there was a lot of gaps, and these even though there were some examples where they had community initiatives that led to legislation, like really in Brazil, for instance, where government really supported and the community engagement in protection of community conserved areas, but we know that was not completely okay because it's just a policy, but still Indigenous people are grappling with eviction from their lands for creation of protected areas or for this mining. And so some gains as well in terms of really areas where we had challenges, but also a lot of some documentation that came into place where we had Indigenous people like led by other support of network of Indigenous people and organization, where they're able to develop indicators to guide the convention, where we also had Indigenous people also giving their local biodiversity outlook to complement what usually is called the Global Biodiversity Outlook. It's a good document you should read, and also the Local Biodiversity Outlook that talks about different cases where biodiversity is conserved based on the convention. And so there are some gains a bit, but also a lot of challenges because still we are facing challenges in biodiversity areas. But for Indigenous people, because there's what we call Article 8J, which talks about traditional knowledge. So we had a lot of outcomes and really a lot of guidelines that came into place on even advising government on how they can support customary sustainable use, or even how they can conduct, cultural, environmental, social impact assessment, like the one you said in your region in Guam. For the Pacific, the military and the impact on your waters, on your cultures, the voluntary guidelines should come into place to support how really the impact assessment was done, because mostly they do environmental impact, but they don't look at the cultural and social. So there are a lot of good products during the 10-year period that came out to support that. And currently, of course, there's ongoing development of the global post-2020 biodiversity framework, which is a new one to come into place to address the challenges. And of course, it's an important space for Indigenous people, for you to engage and to know what is going on. Indigenous people have what we call the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. And online as well, they have a lot of materials where you can engage in virtual processes. In Africa, at least the Indigenous Forum at least is coordinated by Indigenous Information Network, but also usually globally, they're all jointly. And Asia, of course, you also have your contact under AIPP, but also September has experience. So there's a number of organizations working on them, and it's good to get in touch and try to see what is happening in your region and the contribution they're putting in this global post-2020 biodiversity process. We also have the Women Caucus, Indigenous Women Biodiversity Network, that are also contributing to this. And I think it's not easy to learn in one go. The best is really to engage with these platforms, try to see what in your country does strategy exist in terms of biodiversity, even for forests, for water. Understand who's your focal point, because as Indigenous people, you have opportunity to participate in these processes, and there's a voluntary fund as well to enable participation. You have to apply, it's competitive, but also there's opportunity to also give your case studies as well to show positive aspects of your community in managing biodiversity, but also challenges. And of course, currently there's a revision of biodiversity strategy. And so please engage at national level. If you're in Guam, if you're in Philippines, if you're in Indonesia, if you're in Guatemala, to see what processes are there for Indigenous people, even other NGOs to engage, to influence these biodiversity strategies, because countries are working as well, will work to develop their own based also on the global one that is being strengthened, and people are contributing to it. And of course, usually they have opportunities for regional capacity building. So please try to see the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. Who is your focal point? How should you engage so that you take advantage of these opportunities to also participate as Indigenous people? I don't know if there's any question before we proceed. Okay.
Hello, do you hear me?
Yes.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I don't understand the way how indigenous people can participate in this in conventions. I didn't get it.
Okay. So Sahim, usually for this convention on biological diversity, each convention has a different way of accrediting people. But under the conventions, all of them have different constituencies. So it's recognized. So we have the indigenous people, local communities constituency. There's the women constituency. You have the environmental, non-governmental organization. There's UN as observers, and all of this process, you are there as observers. And so for the UN biodiversity process, an indigenous organization can apply to be an observer, to have observer status. And even if you don't have, you can get accredited to participate through a registered organization, whether in your region or in Asia. They can accredit you if you are aware of which one is. And that allows you to participate when the convention process is happening. However, there's cost to it. You can get registration, but then there's what we call under UNCBD, UN Voluntary Fund for indigenous people, that people, they have a call usually to apply. And if you are accredited, you can apply through it, and you have to be endorsed by your organization. And that allows you, if you get funding support, to participate. That does not limit you if you are not engaging that. You can engage at national level. Every government has a national focal point. So it's good to know which is your focal office. What are their processes? Do they have a multi-stakeholder platform, for instance? So you have to be aware, and don't think about starting globally if you've not learned what is happening within your country, because it's important as well. And so also some organization can have the capacity to have their own resources to engage in such processes. UNCBD happens every 2 years, the process, but in between, there's usually what you call the working group meetings. And usually they'll indicate in their website and communicate. So it's good to also see from your region and to join the listserv for the biodiversity process, because also there you get communication and see what are indigenous people contributing to such process. I don't know if I've answered you.
Thank you, Doctor.
Yeah. So, is there any question? No, I don't see any hand. So in terms of, I see Regina. Okay, Regina.
Okay, thank you. I hope you can hear me clearly. Okay, so what I understand is from my reading that United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity, like signed by 192 countries, and the signatories to the convention commit to the protection of biodiversity. However, developed nations are the UN biggest financial backer and set organization policy and agenda. Like their excessive hunger for commodities and energy are the primary cause of global environmental degradation. Since the nation mainly responsible for destroying the environmental are now developing like quote protective concept and shaping environmental policy. So my question is whether their primary drivers are the convention of nature or commercial interests, like because of the continuous economic growth and increasing resources consumption are not compatible with conserving nature. So, and furthermore, the convention does not provide for any way to enforce sanction if environmental standards are not observed. So, and my other question is there any neutral body without vested interests to monitor compliance with regulation on objective and impose to a tough sanction in case of violation? So, and then my second, and in the third one is like, in the part of the goals and obligation, convention is established by the member state and can be deemed binding under the international law when ratified. And there lies the problem. Like countries can recognize the content as binding, but they are not required to do so. So some developed countries, there are also like huge difference between what politicians and officials are willing to say and there are realities on the ground. For example, like there are some big country that portray itself as like a pioneer of climate protection, but then they start saying that other countries like developing countries the causing of like deforestation and stuff. But the truth is they are also like the huge consumptions of the industries of the resources. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for you, Regina, and excellent observations. In terms of conventions, we know the convention that our countries agreed to. It is an agreement, you know, and our states are offering their consent to be bound by these principles that they've set out. And once they've ratified, of course, that's in principle. Of course, in reality, they're supposed to be bound by this since they've signed onto it. But what we know, the biggest flaw has been on issues of enforcement. There is not law or international court that will take them, you know, and say, Indonesia did not, meet this contravene this this policy, this convention, and so we are going to take it to the court. And that's why recently, because human rights law is binding, that's why there's a lot of movement now to try to move link human rights to environment and to link it so that it can be allowed for that enforcement of this convention, because they're just there in paper. So biodiversity has been there for 15 years. What have we seen in terms of the impact it has had, you see? So that is the challenge that are there, because it's still not per se legally binding, because we haven't put it into a statutory form that allows for it to bind. And you know, they use interchangeably. It could be a convention, they say treaties, you know, and these are international law, but you know, each country is supposed to domesticate. And that's where the problem, because it allows for respect of sovereignty as well. And this brings a challenge, because sometimes you find some areas, a state can have ratified maybe the Convention of Biological Diversity, but then they'll have an area where they opt out, an element where they do not agree. We have, like, for instance, US, the part on equitable benefit sharing, they did not approve of the Nagoya Protocol. So there are parties, but there are areas where they did not cover. And so it leaves a loophole when all of you are not. So you can see it as rules, but that are not easily enforced by the law court, you know. So you cannot take it to court, but there is a lot of progress in terms of how to really move it beyond that, and so that it can really be rules that can be enforced, because laws can be enforced, but conventions really are just there to set out principles, you know, that countries can take and also can really adhere to. But there's no enforcement, even though they're supposed to report. So they'll be given recommendation on how they can advance it. But we know that's a challenge, and that's why we are where we are, and that's why we need to engage in such processes. And the new biodiversity framework is supposed to come in and address that in place. We can't answer your your question is excellent in one go, because it's a complicated one, and that's why you see these processes are separated from the human rights process, and so gives a challenge in terms of how issues can be addressed at the global space and also at the national space. And that's why we need to be in these spaces and highlight you are facing loss because of this and this. and bring those cases of good practice and also challenges that needs to be addressed, because some countries are listening, some are not, majority, and that's the challenge that's there. So hopefully I've answered, but also please note it's a conversation that can be ongoing. You can reach out to me. It's something that you cannot even respond in one go. And it's a complex to understand how the conventions work and how decisions are made. They make very beautiful decisions, but enforcement is the biggest challenge. So I know our time is limited, but also moving on to climate change. I'd like to know anyone if they can share what do you understand, like what are some of the impacts of climate change or how it's manifested in your locality. Let me see who hasn't spoken. They've written. We have Juliana. Juliana, if you can share some of the climate change manifestation or impact you've seen in your community. There's Elizabeth, whoever is available. I don't see.
Hola, sí, muy buenos días por acá. Yes, hello, good morning. Here in our area, climate change could be, as a definition, or more than a definition,
Resentir de inicio donde yo soy originaria, son lugares que ha sido
are areas where it's been hot. However, it's been really unbearably hot. For example, my parents plant corn, watermelon, things that are from this region without weather, but right now they plant other products for consumption, and they talk about drought, the drought that they're suffering this season, and they're referring to the fact that they used to read and they knew when rains were coming to prepare the land, and those times no longer coincide with the calendar year. Those seasons don't coincide. So over the years, they were able to follow cycles. They had a specific path that they followed with their calendars, but they can no longer keep that. They have no control over that. So they cannot follow the same patterns for their planting seasons and the products they have. So for those who work the fields, they're just now looking for consumption products, whatever they can do. So they no longer have the system. In terms of irrigation system, now they're using a system like that, and they use that irrigation system to be able to follow the planting patterns, and it is very expensive. It uses a lot of water. Not everyone can use it. Only companies that are able to hoard basically and grab all the grains and all the seeds, and they do it thinking commercially. That's unfortunate because the majority of our peoples and our communities they planned for their family consumption.
Bueno, yo emigré a la capital cuando me vine a estudiar. Y acá en la
I immigrated to the capital to study,
y ahora veo que
and
ya no está haciendo tanto frío, sino hace mucho.
I realize even here it's not as cold as it used to be. It's much warmer.
Y la gente lo está sintiendo porque está
And
acostumbrada
people are noticing that because
a un clima más fresco.
they're used to being in a cooler climate.
También he empezado a ver que se
I've
han
also
disparado incendios
started to see that we're starting
en
to
la
have
capital
fires,
de la ciudad,
even in the capital city of Mexico,
pues por todo este calentamiento.
because of all of this
Creo que eso es muy devastador.
warming, global warming. It's
Los
devastating
pueblos indígenas ya lo han dicho, no solo
because
en estas convenciones,
Indigenous people have
solo a nivel
talked about
internacional,
this, not only in these conventions, not only at international levels, but also at local levels. And we have said that we can't continue to use the land like this.
Pachamama como también
She's Mother Earth, she's Pachamama, we call her.
estilo de vida.
She can't continue to bear this assault. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Gracias, Elizabeth. You've said it so well in terms of impacts of climate change and also what causes it. So climate change is observance of changes in the climate that's recorded for a period of over 40 years. So since the 80s, scientists have been observing and there have been changes. And it's important to note that what has caused it is industrialization and changes in the way we use land, which release emissions and gases, what they call greenhouse gas, which in turn affect our ecosystem. So that means it changes the way the air feels. It affects the ocean. So there's more acidification in terms of the coral. There's more melting ice. I see there's none from the Arctic, but those in colder places know. And so when it's too warm, you find that you have extreme weather. And when you have this extreme weather, this in turn causes impacts so that there's a lot of heat, temperatures are rising. You have flooding, and I see someone has said flooding. You find that loss of water supply, clean water. There's a lot of food insecurity. Our forests either catch fire or they don't grow anymore like they used to. We lose some plants. You find that malaria, for instance, you have some pests also going to places that were considered cold for them. We lose our biodiversity. The fish stocks for those living in water ecosystem in islands is reduced. So it's important to know how these impacts also relate to how it impacts your people. So you'll get this PowerPoint and you'll be able to see how it's manifesting. So basically, this is just a diagram that depicts, usually inside you'll see the greenhouse gas emission and overall how it causes the changes in the ecosystem and also the impact it has on people and ecosystems. And basically it's a problem because we share a common planet, and that's why it concerns everyone, whether someone is in the Pacific, in Africa. The problem is we face different impacts, but we are also impacted by these rising temperatures. There's no one who's safer now with these constant changes and sea level rise, we get flooding in other places. So these changes affect how we live and for everyone. And that's why it's an important, even the US, because we have those who are polluting the environment more, like US, China, India, Brazil, because they have a lot of industries. But then they're also being impacted. They were getting flooding a lot. But then before they started getting impacts, we have been suffering ourselves because we've not contributed. And so the convention itself is coming into place to really govern how communities, how countries can really tackle climate change issues and especially the human causes, because when we farm unsustainably, we industrialize, we impact the climate itself. And so the convention comes into place to help countries tackle it, and also to have a common understanding on how they're supposed to tackle each. And under it, we have those are developed countries and developing countries, and also the least developed countries and the small island states, which are also under the developing countries. And so there's call for differentiations on how these countries can tackle climate change impact and also support people to really reduce impact. So it's two levels. There's support supposed to be for adaptation and mitigation, really supporting community to adapt. We know there's drought. There's no way you say someone can bring rain. What can you support this community to really adapt? So sometimes you'll find opportunities to alternative livelihood or initiative really to protect your water ecosystems. All those fall under adaptation. For mitigation, it's really measures that countries know there's still deforestation happening. So how can we tackle, because forests absorb carbon, the bad air, but if we don't have enough forests, they don't absorb. So they give support to really countries to plant trees and such. And that's why you see the challenge of oil palm, because it qualifies as mitigation measures in some cases. And so that is the challenge that emanates and brings conflict. But you have to know there are different protocols that came into place that help countries. And the most recent and important one that you have to get it and read and to understand is called the Paris Agreement. This calls for countries to really define how at the country level, in Indonesia, in Philippines, in Kenya, in Egypt, in Guatemala, or in Peru, how are they going to address climate change in the different areas in adaptation and mitigation. And so countries were supposed to develop and have developed. Even the first round is finished, and they reviewed the second one, the nationally determined contribution, because the world is warming and they're supposed to show measures they're putting in place to contribute to reducing that. And so we know a number of countries have that in place. And this is just a structure, just like this Convention on Biological Diversity. You can read it at your own time. But countries developed this nationally determined contribution and based on the Paris Agreement. But of importance is for you to know that in 2015, the Paris Agreement, we've had some significant importance to Indigenous people, recognition of their rights, and also their contribution of the traditional knowledge in building climate resilience. And a platform was created called the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform, which brings together different knowledge holders globally to talk about how they're handling climate change at different levels. Because I know for different communities, even here, you know how you're managing climate change. I come from a pastoralist community, so they'll do mobility, rotational grazing, so that they manage the way they use the land. So those experiences is what Climate Convention wants Indigenous people to bring through this platform. And under it, we have what we call the facilitative working group. And these are three, it's an Indigenous peoples and government representation. And we have 7 from Indigenous people, each from each region. I sit for Africa, and I have an alternate from Morocco, North Africa, but you also have from other regions who are representing Indigenous people. And so it's important as well to go into the UNFCCC website and to see what does it say about the local communities and Indigenous peoples platform, because it has a strategy and a work plan that has to be implemented to ensure Indigenous issues are embedded into climate change. Also of importance as Indigenous women, we have the gender work plan that is adopted, talks a lot about Indigenous women involvement in climate policy and action, not only globally, but also at national level. And each country is supposed to designate a national gender focal point. So know who's your gender focal point, see what does the gender action plan talk about, because it talks about steps really to ensure women are participating in climate policy making at local level, even global, and ensure their leadership is strengthened and they're supported. So please have a look at it. It will take time and we don't have enough time to go through all the gender action plan, but it's an interesting one. And engagement of Indigenous people in this process is important because it helped advance Indigenous people's work in this convention, and also inclusion of Indigenous women in the gender action plan that was designed and also negotiated. And you have to know, for climate change convention, they've had 27 meetings so far. Each year we have a climate change meeting. For CBD, it's every 2 years. But for climate change, they see it as a bigger threat even to biodiversity and life. So every year, November to December, there's a meeting, but in between, maybe during May, June, there's an intersession to prepare for the conference itself. So this year, it will be held in December in Dubai. So it's usually a 2-week meeting for negotiation. And maybe some of you have participated or not, but it's an interesting process where you see how negotiation and government agree on decision. And a lot of key areas where they're deciding is support to our countries, which are called developing countries, or least developed countries, or small island developing states, to support them to respond to climate change. Because as our countries, we did not contribute to this climate change, but we are suffering the impact. So the convention set out the role, that mandate that the developed countries, the USA, Europe, have to pay for the damage they caused to to the climate, and for us to really respond to the impact. But we know $1 billion was pledged, but has not been realized until today. Since 2015, they were supposed to put $1 billion because that was the calculation of the cost it will take. So it hasn't been realized. And so that's why there's a lot of engagement in this process ongoing. So it's a lot of politics as well playing. And now it's issues about finance, how they can support the loss and damage facing. Someone has talked about the loss of livestock dying. People are dying, people are migrating. Those in islands are almost being covered. Where will they go? So a lot of discussions around this support, and also how to support food security in agriculture, water issues and so forth. But basically for Indigenous women, you have to know why is it important for you to engage. And I think a lot of you highlighted earlier, because these impacts have been felt for generations, but also it affects our knowledge. So if you are moved from your community, or climate has impacted your forest resources, and that's where you depend, and you're not just linked there in land. So relation to land is important to perpetuate our knowledge. And so what you've seen is Indigenous women also have critical knowledge and implement collective responses to climate change. And that's why it's important to engage in such spaces. And we've seen a number of Indigenous women really growing and engaging in such processes to influence climate change. So I'll not go through this. Just like the biodiversity process, we have the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change, which is recognized constituency to influence how, where we use as a platform to negotiate. All Indigenous people, whether from Africa, Asia, we congregate and we bring our own experiences, but also come to one decision on what we want to advocate at the climate policy space. And so that is the space we use. The voluntary fund, also based on in Geneva, the Office of the High Commissioner, has started to support participation of Indigenous people in climate process, so which is a plus, because we never had that kind of funding. And so this helps us to engage in process where you don't have funding. It's competitive. They cannot fund everyone, but it's important to know that it exists there to support participation. And also we have Indigenous peoples who are accredited to climate convention, which is different from the climate, from the biodiversity convention. So you have to know all this convention, take your time with, know how to engage. We have this constituency, the Indigenous Forum on Climate Change has a website. You can see the statements they give and the information. Know who's, if you go to the website, you'll know who's accredited organization from your region. The challenge with the biodiversity climate convention, they have a limit in the number that can participate. So accredited organizations are the only one who can apply on behalf of people. So they can accredit, let's say Indigenous Information Network has, or maybe one from Guam has. So you have to register through that, and then they give you a number and say you can only have 5 people or 2 people participating. And you have to have those 2, but there's a space to also request and say, we have Indigenous people with funding, can you allow us more space? And that is because of Indigenous people relating and engaging in this process that you get to know there's a leeway to ask for more space. And so just know that convention, you have to be accredited to participate. And that is the biggest challenge, but for all convention as well, it's accreditation and the resources as well, and also their technical processes. So you have to take time to learn. You don't have to be in climate or in biodiversity both. You can start with one and see what works for you and build your capacity. I know we are running out of time, but I'd like to ask if there's any question on the climate convention. I don't see any. Just know it can be overwhelming because it's complex to break it down, but you can take time to read. Sometimes also, I think FIMI will have the global process to prepare for climate convention process of biodiversity. So that could be a process as well for you to take your time, commit time just to join to learn more about the convention, because then it's more time to break it down and also delve further. But this is just to give you the basics, and then you do the more work to learn about it. So the other third convention is the convention to combat desertification. So as you know, we have deserts like those in North Africa, there's the Sahel. Kenya, we have the Chalbi. Egypt as well, Asia, there's desertification everywhere. And this is a form where our land is degrading. So you find that water is no longer there, vegetation is affected. And the main cause is really human activity. So people are maybe indulging in agriculture, deforestation is happening, and also climate change affects. And so this impacts more the soil, which also causes other impacts like loss of food production capacity. People are displaced when there's a lot of drought, for instance, and there's a lot, or when there's too much flooding because there's no forest to curb water that is coming and soil is not absorbing, so degradation happens. And so also this convention is really looking at how can countries manage their drylands. So you'd assume in North America there is no dryland, but there is. So they started particularly with a focus in Africa, but other countries are now facing desertification and realizing it's a global challenge. And so it's starting to get the focus that it wants globally. And also for this convention, they meet every 2 years, like the CBD convention. They've had 15 conference of party held. I think there's a typo there, just like the CBD, because they came into around the same time. And what is important to know, that they have regional coordination bodies. So Africa, Asia, and Latin America have bodies that are supporting studies and information on how countries are handling desertification, and to also know the status of desertification. And just like the CBD, I see a comment on from Elizabeth. It's in Spanish. Please help me with translation. Since I don't have access to the Google Translate, kindly one of the interpreters. So you have to know this convention, all of them have a focal point at your country level, and they are always housed in the ministry. So you'll find maybe they're in the Ministry of Environment or Ministry of Lands. So please go check and see who's your country focal point, what communication have they been sharing, and also the plans they have in terms of national drought plans and so forth. So please know that.
Edna, Elizabeth's question is this convention binding? How can it really make countries commit to do so?
Okay, thank you. And we'll respond to that. Thank you, Elizabeth. And thank you for the support interpreter for giving us the feedback. So you have to know all these conventions because of importance, even though we'd assume it's not legally binding because it's commitment. There's some aspect because at country level, they've ratified and there's linkage in terms of what they put in place in terms of what they do, and the countries come up with action plans. So if you don't engage and influence those action plans and also highlight the countries have not met that commitment, then we cannot be able, because others will leave the countries to go scot-free and also not address. And that's why even for climate change, there's a process called the global stocktake, which is to show how countries are implementing the gaps, and Indigenous people and everyone had the opportunity to input into that process, because then it's gonna inform how strategies are set. So it's important to engage in these processes. And of course, countries are supposed to also really engage with women and youth and really to work on, combating desertification, but are they doing it? And so engaging in this process is to highlight Indigenous people's best practices and the challenges, and also showcasing what country is not doing right or what it's doing right. And that's our space also to demand the strengthening. And I think that's why Indigenous people are engaging in these processes really to try and see how they can influence the decision making, and of course participate in also process of capacity building, also to raise awareness on how we do things and what government can do to address the challenge. And I think we can't go through and for you to understand all of it, but just have the basics so that it can help you. And the final one, because your time is limited, but it's the Convention on Organic Pollutants. And basically where you are, someone talked about chemicals getting into the water, those who are manufacturing or doing extractive work. And we know they get into the water ecosystem, or those who are doing mining, for instance, mercury gets into water, and it in turn gets into our plants. You drink the water, it gets into our livestock, and it gets into the fish. And as a woman, when you consume, it will also go to the child or also go to your body as well and damage. And so I see your question, Pema, I'll respond to it. And so this impact human health, and that's why there was a birth of 3 conventions: the Rotterdam Convention, the Convention on or Basel Convention, and all these conventions. What it's supposed to govern is really human exposure, really, and the disposal of this waste. How waste is managed at a country level, including even what products are used even in treating, in medicine, So there's a lot of contamination that was monitored and see even from extraction of fossil fuel, or how we manage waste, and also how agriculture is done and the chemicals that are used. If you read this statement, then it's easy diagram to know. And so to ensure food quality, of course, and air quality and the quality of water, these conventions are in place to address this. So there are 3 conventions. Each has a different role. So read about them because it's huge, but most of our countries, from developing countries, all of you here are parties to it. For the Stockholm, Rotterdam, and Basel, and they always also hold the meeting different times. And of course, they have the conferences as well to discuss on how countries are managing pollution in their country, how they're managing wastes as well. And they really have this, what we call the monitoring plan and the global assessment report that really provide important resource. What I've seen is that we've had a lot of engagement from those Indigenous people from Arctic and North America. A lot we've not had. We've had a challenge with engagement from Africa and Asia, and it's because it's complex, and also you need this convention. If you want to give data of the impact, they want scientific and the tests to show really the impact to people, you know. So it's kind of interesting process as well to engage in if you are faced with the pollution impact, like those who have cancers resulting from this chemical disposal in your lands, even from the military as well, falls under this. And so really is to know the ways of participation. They also have the focal points and also action plans that countries are supposed to implement. And I stop there. I know there's a lot of questions and a lot of questions and also information, but I urge you to really read a lot about the conventions. I'm available. Sometimes some Indigenous brothers and sisters would reach out to me. FIMI also has sometimes I need the dialogues to really learn about this, even other civil society organizations, and even the women gender constituency, Women for Biodiversity. So it's important to engage in such processes, because our governments don't follow what we do, but it's important to see how to engage and influence these policies. So I stop there, and thank you for listening to me. And we could talk about the process in later processes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Edna. And thank you for your time. And thank you, sisters, also for your contributions and for the many questions that you have in chat. What we'll do is that we'll take these questions from chat and share them with Edna. And then when she responds to them, they'll be uploaded on the Google Drive where your notes are. And so thank you so much, Edna. Thank you for sharing with us your knowledge and your experience. Please note that all these conventions, for many people, it takes years for people to figure out how they work. So please don't feel a type of way if you haven't gotten everything during this session. As Edna has said, you're encouraged to read about the conventions and see how you can interact and how you can participate in those conventions. And just to note that the same voluntary fund that Moss was talking about a few days ago is the same voluntary fund that Edna has referred to right now. So please, those are the ones that you need to look at. So Edna, just to appreciate you, we have a certificate of appreciation for you from the Global School. Yes, there it is. It's a very beautiful recognition. So the International Indigenous Women's Forum, the Indigenous Women's Global Leadership School, in recognition to Edna Kaptoya for the participation and contribution in the capacity building of Indigenous women leaders from Africa, Asia, Latin America, North America, and the Pacific during the 10th edition of the Program on Human Rights and International Advocacy Skills. With gratitude by this virtual modality, signed by the Executive Director, Teresa Zapeta. We will email you this beautiful certificate, Edna, so that you can also keep it to remember this session that you have had with us. And we thank you again. Please know that we will follow up with the many questions that we have on the chat about the different conventions or what you've spoken about, because it looks like everyone is interested to know how they can participate, because all these things affect us in our communities. So again, thank you so much, sisters. And our next speakers are here, and I want to invite Joy so that she can formally invite them for the next session. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Winnie, and thank you so much, Sister Edna, for your session. I hope we will be able to meet you soon one day in person. And thank you for being with us, and all the best. So moving forward, we will now continue with the second part of the session today. And we have two very special guests who are a part of the IFAD Indigenous Peoples team. So we have Carla Sofia Vidal and Margarita Lodoni. Welcome, sisters. They will be speaking to us on food security and rural development, and will also be sharing the strategies and spaces of global impact. Just a little, a brief introduction about Carla. She is a national from Mexico. She is a lawyer with a master's degree in development, focusing on the Beyond Viri perspectives. And since 2018, she has been part of the Indigenous Peoples team at IFAD, supporting the work of IPAF and the free, prior, and informed consent processes in IFAD-funded projects. Margarita, who is also going to accompany Carla in today's session, is an environmental engineer with a PhD on Tanzania, and she has been with the Indigenous Peoples team at IFAD since 2014. In the past years, she has mainly been supporting the processes related to the Indigenous Peoples Forum at IFAD and the Indigenous Peoples Assistance Facility, IPAF, and she is trained in autobiographical writings and methodologies. Welcome, Carla and Margarita. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Joy, and thanks to all for inviting us to be here with you today. It's a real pleasure. We are connecting today with you from Rome, and we greet all of you in your territories, in your geographies, with a very big hug from the heart. And Marge?
Yes, thank you. It's really an honor for us to be here. We've been reading the bios from the participants, and we are really here in a learning mode, I would say. What we can do from our part will be to share some of the experience and instruments that we have at IFAD in terms of engagement with Indigenous peoples. But we are really here like with our words, but also with our emotions. And we are really interested in learning from you on how we can improve our work with Indigenous peoples. So I will give the floor to Carla now for a first session, which is like an overall presentation on the main activities implemented at IFAD with Indigenous peoples. Then we would like to propose like a Q&A session, and then another brief intervention on the Indigenous People Assistance Facility, which is a funding instrument that we have at IFAD, and then another space for Q&A. So we would really like to have more time for and space for sharing and comments. Thank you. Over.
Thank you, Margie. So now I will start sharing my screen. Let me know when you can see this. Okay. So feel free to write maybe in the chat if you get any idea while I'm speaking, so that we don't lose it. And we are ready also for the interactive part of the session. So first we wanted to introduce you to IFAD, and the place where both Marga and I are working for the Indigenous Peoples team. IFAD is the International Fund for Agricultural Development. It invests in rural people. Its mandates within the UN system. It's on rural people, rural areas, and agriculture, improving food security and nutrition, and increasing incomes and strengthening resilience. It is a specialized UN agency and a financial institution, so it has a very particular composition. It is all around the world. It's active in 92 countries, and you can see the HQ are based in Rome, and their offices in 40 countries. What IFAD does is provide loans, grants, and technical assistance. This is the business model, let's say, the way it works. And it with developing countries, and the projects, the big projects loans are implemented by governments. So this is something we can discuss even later if you have any doubt about it. But then what we will see at the end is that there are mechanisms to for Indigenous peoples to direct access to these financial or technical assistance from IFAD. So here are the key instruments for engagement of Indigenous peoples within this fund that we wanted to share with you. And first we have the policy of engagement with Indigenous peoples. It was the first policy was done back in 2009, and it was just updated last December. I have another slide on the policy. We have the IPES forum that I will describe in detail, country programs and different activities, policy engagement, knowledge management, and finally, our very dear IPAF, the Indigenous Peoples Assistance Facility. So on the policy on engagement with Indigenous peoples, as I told you, it was just updated. So it is not completely new, but there were some twists, let's say, to this policy. And first, we had only 9 principles of engagements that you can see in your screen, and there was a 10th principle that was added last year through consultations. It was a process called by the steering committee of the forum and the IFAD itself, and it's on food sovereignty, food security, and nutrition. Another key message from the update is looking at working with Indigenous peoples as horizontal partners, leaving behind the beneficiary narrative so that Indigenous peoples are actors of the designs and the decision-making of the forum, of the fund. The next that we wanted to share as a mechanism for engagement, let's say like the policy gives us the whole framework, and then we have a forum that is this systematic dialogue between Indigenous peoples and IFAD staff and IFAD also governing bodies. It has its objectives as monitoring and evaluating the IPES policy, the Indigenous peoples policy at IFAD, strengthen the partnership and promoting participation. What happens at the end of the forum is that the Indigenous peoples give a synthesis of deliberations when they have their recommendations to states, to the fund, and commitments as Indigenous peoples. The governance of this forum is done. There is a steering committee for the forum. The composition are Indigenous peoples organizations, members of the permanent forum, members of IPAF, and there is a gender balance and also youth representation by region. The 6th forum just happened this February, so we are very fresh from that process, and it was on Indigenous peoples' climate leadership. I think we can share maybe the link to the website where you can see all the materials, the synthesis of deliberations, and also there are the recording, all the documentations are there. This is more or less the methodology of the forum. We have regional consultations every 2 years, and then also the global meetings. This year was in person. We had the one before that was online, but it's usually in person. And then we have also the Indigenous Peoples Awards. We issue a call before the forum, and then there is a selection committee to identify the winners, and it has, of course, the objective to share best practices, knowledge, and showcase and replicate results. So moving on to IFAD country programs. These, as I mentioned at the beginning, are the loans of IFAD, that it's also a financial institution, so they give loans to the governments and then implement the projects. Here you can see some numbers about the projects that are ongoing. For instance, we have 84 projects in 45 countries. All the projects that are targeting Indigenous peoples or geographical targeting where indigenous peoples live, they need to seek free, prior, and informed consent. It's part of the safeguards of the fund. So we are developing this methodology where indigenous consultants are joining the missions of design. In some cases, we are testing this so that the visions of indigenous peoples are included at the design of these projects, no? And we're calling it, as we've learned, the co-designing, co-creation of the solutions. Currently, we have these experiences in Ethiopia, Vietnam, Mexico, and Kenya. And we are learning a lot, and we hope that we will replicate this in the future and scale up. Another line of work, we have the projects, but they're also in an upper level of IFAD world, country strategies. No, they develop strategies with the countries where they will afterwards give loans. So this is also a very important moment of influence, let's say, the agenda of what the fund will lend money for. So there are also some consultations at this country strategy stage. So it's a very key moment we see, and we are moving forward to understand how to influence more and more these country strategies. As you can see, in the past 2 years, we had these ones that were targeting indigenous peoples. And then we have other activities like the national and global policy engagement supporting different arenas like the UNFCCC COP, the CBD COP, interagency support group on indigenous peoples issues, the permanent forum. Hopefully we will be there participating next April. National policy dialogues for inclusion of IPs. This is something that has been done by IFAD, supporting these policy dialogues at the country level, and also promoting and strengthening Rome-based agency collaborations. Rome-based agencies are the 3 agencies of the UN that are based here, that are the World Food Programme, FAO, and IFAD. So when you hear about the RBAs, it means those organizations. And then evidence-based knowledge management, we have technical notes on indigenous peoples to help design projects that are being developed by indigenous peoples organizations, most of them. And then we have grants also, where indigenous peoples can benefit as well, and IPAF is one of these grants. So hoping that I didn't take a lot of time. I know it was a lot of information, but we'll stop for a while to hear from you, your doubts. I know it's a lot, but also your suggestions, your experiences on these kind of engagements, and then we move forward to the IPAF, the Indigenous Peoples Assistance Facility. So feel free to raise your hands, to take the mic if you want some clarification on this, on how you can engage in these processes, how it's done, no, this influencing, or how do you see it possible in general?
Irene, would you like to make a comment? Anyone else?
Your ideas also on how we can improve maybe the communication between these global processes and the organizations and the processes that you are leading, as women leaders of indigenous peoples. These are just some ideas that we can discuss.
Please go ahead.
Oh, hi. So I have a question because from what I understand about IFAD, a lot of the focus is on food security and hunger in kind of like developing areas and more rural areas of developing countries. And in the islands, or at least in Guam, we are very like we have an issue of food security, but it's almost tied to like overdevelopment. So even though we have rural areas, we just, because so much of our island was kind of created to be like a food desert, and because of colonization and militarization, our issues with food security have a lot to do with Guam importing like 90% of its food. And so we barely produce any of the food we eat. And it's not necessarily because we don't have any, like we're not a developed nation. It's almost because we're overdeveloped, and because all of the arable land that can be used for farming, or the best land that was used for farming, is currently kind of occupied by the military. And so we were just talking about food security in one of our organizations and about how difficult it is for Guam to support a local agricultural industry, or even just kind of promote food sustainability, because we're so heavily dependent on American imports. And I kind of was wondering what IFAD and how they approach agricultural development in nations or in countries or in territories that might not necessarily be developing, but almost rely too much on imports, and because they're kind of like a food desert, because that's kind of the situation that I find Guam in.
I will try to reply very quickly, but I think maybe we can also invite other participants to give their views on this, because only looking at IFAD, that is one actor, no, in this whole universe of development, let's say, and also in UN as one specialized agency, no, as I mentioned. So being so specialized, let's say, it has a very clear mandate, no, and the fund can only go to certain geographical areas, in a sense. So they don't have the freedom to choose where to go and where to work. And for instance, we receive a lot of comments from the Arctic, for instance, no, like there are indigenous peoples, but the fund cannot enter there. But still, what can be done, no, is looking at the knowledge side of the fund. What is it doing at this level that can bring some solutions and can bring some information, knowledge to debate about it, no? And I think what you say about the food deserts, no, learning from these experiences so that they are not replicated in other spaces is very, very important.
Thank you.
I don't know if maybe someone else wants to add more on this point, because I think it's very interesting. Also, the idea of food deserts, or as something that has been actually brought by development programs, no? And how can this be prevented in the future? See how? We can see your hand.
Okay. I'm just thinking if it goes to agriculture sector, it's related to desert because I'm living in desert and we have our own land, but we need like the Bedouin people have their own land here. Like, what do you think? We are in Egypt. What do you think if it's good to apply for this fund or not? And what's the process for that? And we have also to apply through a certain organization or something like that. You understand me?
I understood the first part about how can you access to the funds, but there was a second part that I didn't get, sorry.
The second part, which I have to apply through a specific organization.
Okay. So as we mentioned at the beginning, we divided our presentations into two steps. No, and what I did was to present the whole model of the fund, how it works through governments. Then we will hear from Margarita on a different modality, but on this I want to clarify it's through the governments, like they have these policies in place and they are implementing it through their own ministries or something. So what I will do, for instance, I did already here in the chat box for Indonesia, share the specific website that the fund has for each of the countries. So you can see there which are the projects that have been done in the past, that are ongoing, and also the projects that are planned. You can see in that website. And one of the things that emerged during the forum this February was how can we participate more and more, like increase our participations of indigenous peoples organizations in these portfolios, country portfolios. And they decided to push this idea forward. We want to connect with IFAD country teams. We want to be up to date on what is being planned, so we can also influence what they are doing. So participating in meetings with the country programs, letting them know of the work that you are doing so that they can also get ideas of intervention or creating partnerships, because we know, right, that who else knows better how to work with the communities than yourselves that live in the communities, instead of designing a project from far away. So these kind of messages are moving forward, and the idea is this, to increase the dialogue between indigenous peoples and the organizations and the fund. So in that website, I will share the one for Egypt, because we have ongoing projects in Egypt. I don't think they target indigenous peoples, because then there is another challenge. A lot of challenges, right? Not many solutions, but it's what the universe that we are working on is the issue of recognition. What happens when a government doesn't recognize indigenous peoples? And we work through governments, right? So if with their safeguards, their principles of engagements, they come and ask, no, we need free, prior, and informed consent, even if indigenous peoples are not fully recognized. Our mandate is to ask for free, prior, and informed consent, for instance, and here we can support the local processes in this sense. I'll stop here. Sorry, I want to hear from you, but I'm sure we would need more than 1 hour for all of these discussions. Maybe to end, because I'm looking at the chat box, I see another question. Thank you, Sehan. ¿Puedo responder quizá a esta pregunta en español, si está bien? Solo doy un segundito para el cambio de idioma, que la pregunta
from our Elizabeth, where she says the resources from IFAD, where did they come from? All this fund has as an objective to contribute to the lack of food. What happens to countries who do take on loans and the climate change, the impact on the climate change continues? Absolutely. The resources from IFAD come from a cycle that in English is called cycle, where the countries replenish so that in this bag of resources we can have the budget for new projects. So generally, the rule so far that we've seen is that the northern countries, through their taxes, replenish the IFAD, who in turn sends the funds to the subglobal countries. And then the second part is about their objective to contribute to improving the lack of food and the loans. And the majority of the projects from the IFAD projects, we now we have as objectives that the climate change is taken into consideration. So all of the contributions, all of the interventions have to be sensitive to this. And the issue of loans, the countries taking on loans, that's so the resources come from the north, they go to the south, and they go back to the fund somehow, because not all of the resources are donations. I hope I was able to be clear with that question. And I think that now we can move on to the next section, Margarita, and we're also going to continue paying attention to the chat.
Thank you, Carla. Carla now will share the screen again so that we will use the same presentation. Okay, so as Carla said, actually in the first part of our presentation, we mainly present the loans, no? So the big project implemented by the governments, directly by the governments. In the second part, we focused on the Indigenous People Assistance Facility, and we will share the link in the chat in the 3 languages. The Indigenous People Assistance Facility, it's like a direct funding mechanism, which was in IFAD in 2007, with the idea of providing direct fund from IFAD to Indigenous peoples organization working at community level. Up to now, we issued 6 call for proposals since 2007. So let's say that every 3 years, more or less, we open a call for proposal. With this call for proposal, what we do is to invite Indigenous peoples organization to submit a proposal, which is designed and will be implemented, if approved, by the Indigenous peoples community themselves. So we received I think up to now we received around 5,000 proposals, which is with me, and this means that we have a big database of proposals submitted by Indigenous peoples organizations, but we were able to fund globally 160 proposals since 2007. So more or less in every cycle, we are able to fund around 30-35 proposals. The Indigenous People Assistance Facility, it's, let's say, an innovative instrument. Why? Because, as I said, it's one of the ways to provide direct funding. So with the IPAF, we don't pass through the governments, but the indigenous peoples organization submit their application, and if the project is approved by the EPAF board, and I will explain you a little bit the governance of the EPAF, in that case, the resources will be channeled directly to the indigenous peoples organization. Okay, how IFAD is managing the facility, because it's quite big. We work in Africa, Asia and the Pacific, and in Latin America and the Caribbean. In 2011, IFAD decided to decentralize the facility, which means that at the moment we work with 3 indigenous peoples organizations, which are our partners, regional partners. In Latin America and the Caribbean, FIMI is our regional partner, meaning that FIMI is managing the EPAF, the facility in the region. In Africa, we have Samburu Women Trust. They are based in Kenya. And in Asia and the Pacific, Tepteba is in charge of managing the facility. So what happened is that we provide the resources to the 3 organizations, and then the 3 organizations will channel and will monitor and supervise the projects approved in the regions. We are learning a lot from them. So for us, it's really an amazing occasion for to learn and to see and how to better, let's say, support the indigenous peoples community on the ground in their initiatives. And an important part of the EPAF, we think that lies in the governance, not in the structure. So we have the 3 regional partners, and then we have an EPAF board. The EPAF board is composed by indigenous peoples representative, 1 for each region. Then we have a representative from UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and then there is an IFAD representative. So how if EPAF work, in a nutshell? We receive this year, for instance, last year, for instance, we received about 650 proposals. What happened is that we have indigenous consultants who technically review all the proposals. They see which of the proposals are eligible, which are not, and they provide a rating, so that at the end of the technical review, we have each of the proposal receive some comments on specific aspects like sustainability, the women engagement and youth engagement, and so on. At the end, the EPAF board decide which are the 35 proposals, the best 35 proposals. And then there is a due diligence process, which is conducted by the 3 managers, the 3 regional organizations, and we have the final list of proposals. For this year, we expect to have this final list of proposals in around May, June, and then the project start the implementation. About the amount, the EPAF proposal range from 20,000 up to 70,000, and the implementation period is up to 3 years. So these are more or less some of the criteria. Up to now, the EPAF reached around 120 indigenous peoples beneficiaries. We don't like to use the word beneficiaries, so we reach indigenous peoples community members. 50% were women and girls, and we are trying to mobilize some resources both from countries. For instance, the last call for proposal was financed by the SIDA, which is the International Development Agencies of Sweden. And we are trying to get additional resources because we are really convinced that it's important to fund, to make sure, we have to make sure that the resources really reach at the core of the communities, the indigenous communities. And EPAF is one of the instruments we are trying now to work on this direct funding. As we can see in the next slide, okay, some information on the ongoing cycle. This cycle is focused on climate adaptation and biodiversity management. As I said, it is financed by the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency and David and Lucy Packard Foundation. We will fund around 35 proposals, and what is really important is that one of the criteria for eligibility for a proposal to be eligible is to provide an evidence that a free, prior and informed consent process was conducted. What do I mean? That some of the documents that we require the Indigenous Peoples Organization to submit is not only the application form, which contain the description of the project and so on, but also like an evidence of the fact that the Indigenous peoples community members were involved in the design. So what we want to avoid is to have, let's say, intermediaries like NGOs or other submitting proposal for Indigenous peoples community, but without consulting them. So this is a very important, it's something we are trying to strengthen because it's not easy, as you can imagine. We are not, and our 3 EPAF regional partners are not in the communities. So they are trying to do their very best to understand from the application form, from the evidence of the FPIC, that really the process and the project has been designed by the Indigenous peoples communities. Maybe the next slide, Carly. Okay, now we will, let's say, give some space and we will talk about the EPAF in a different way. We have a very short videos that we want to share with you to have like an idea of what EPAF is. And after the video, we open the floor for questions and comments and so on. Thank you.
I will launch it if you can hear it. Just to let me know. I did all the things for the sound, but just to be sure. Okay, thanks.
The Indigenous Peoples Assistance Facility is an innovative funding instrument that Indigenous communities can use to find solutions to the challenges they face. The objective of the facility is to strengthen Indigenous peoples communities and their organizations. It finances small projects that foster self-driven development. At the global level, EPAF is directed by a board of Indigenous leaders. At a regional level, EPAF is co-managed and coordinated by regional Indigenous peoples organizations as the implementing partners. In the 5 cycles of implementation to date, 159 projects have been financed in more than 45 countries, directly benefiting 110,000 people from Indigenous peoples communities and mobilizing $12.5 million. EPAF comprises 3 main components: empowering Indigenous peoples grassroots organizations, strengthening Indigenous peoples networks and linking them with the global Indigenous movement, and knowledge sharing to support Indigenous peoples solutions.
The establishment of the Indigenous Peoples Forum by IFAD, the adoption of the policies of engagement with Indigenous peoples, as well as the establishment of the Indigenous Peoples Assistance Facility, these moves that IFAD has done are going to matter a lot in terms of better respect for Indigenous peoples' rights and knowledge, as well as better relationships and partnerships between IFAD and Indigenous peoples.
And we have been able to see changes at IFAD. We have been able to see that our facility has been growing over the years. We have been able to see that the senior management of IFAD really listened to our recommendations and to make changes at the regional and country levels. We are there with our voices, through our voices, men and women of Indigenous organizations, and we have been united when we make demands and proposals.
It's really about creating more spaces for Indigenous peoples to engage when they advocate the reversal of historical injustices directed to them.
Indigenous peoples have implemented EPAF through holistic solutions that are rooted in the values of community, solidarity, and respect for Mother Earth, and they have shown their leadership in the stewardship of natural resources, always keeping in mind the generations to come. This facility has served as a successful tool to listen and learn from Indigenous peoples and implement development initiatives, such as improving sustainable agricultural practices, developing new off-farm enterprises, and enhancing market access, developing capacity on Indigenous peoples' rights, revitalizing cultural heritage and traditional knowledge, mapping Indigenous territories and cultures, empowering Indigenous women and youth, boosting disaster and climate change risk management based on traditional knowledge and practices, as well as preserving and promoting local varieties of traditional crops. The EPAF 2022 funding cycle has a focus on climate change adaptation, resilience, and biodiversity, and will be supported by SIDA, the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency.
La alianza de FIMI con IPAF permitió a los pueblos indígenas cosechar saberes ancestrales de acuerdo a nuestros usos y costumbres.
EPAF is an empowering tool. Indigenous peoples are given the driver's seat for development initiatives, and they can operationalize the concept of sustainable and self-determined development in their communities.
EPAF is development with a soul, people, environment, and economics.
Thank you, Carla. And now we open the floor and the space for any question about the EPAF and also any other question that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Margarita and Carla, for your presentation. I would just like to encourage any participant, if you have any question or any questions or a reflection or a comment, or if your organizations has ever been, a beneficiary of the fund, the Indigenous Peoples Assistance Facility Fund, and also IFAD. Jean-Marie, please go ahead.
Me ha gustado mucho la presentación.
I really like the presentation, and I just have a little question. I know what you talked about the criteria for selection for the project, but I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the projects. What are the points that you really consider important when you look at a proposal?
Okay, I will speak in English. Okay, we have the translation. Yes, Johnny, thank you for your question. Now, we will share with you the call for proposal, where you can find the 7 criteria that the technical reviewers take into account when rating and reviewing the proposal. These are mainly about the sustainability of the proposals, about the project relevance. So to what extent the project is relevant for the Indigenous peoples community and is like addressing the main challenges of the communities. Another very important point is to what extent the project build on the identity of Indigenous peoples, on their culture, on their knowledge, because we can, how can we define like for an Indigenous community? So it's we can have like what is a access to market for for a project, no? What does it mean, access to market? What kind of product, what kind of network we are considering? And so in the call for application and in some of the documents that we will share, you will see that what EPAF we will try to fund and is trying to fund is initiatives which are really based on the and rooted in the way of life of the community. So this is the very central aspect, no? Try to understand for the technical reviewers and from the EPAF board how the project really build on what is already there, because it's not something that we don't need to fund initiatives that are new, but something and a lot is already there. So maybe the EPAF and the resources provided by the EPAF will be just something that really can support what is already in place, what is already there. No, this is a very important aspect that is taken into account by the technical reviewer. And then, of course, the EPAF gives a lot of importance to the women empowerment. So this is another aspect which is evaluated and assessed by the technical reviewer, and not only in terms of the objective of the project, but also in how the project is managed. No? So do we have women and youth managing the project? Which kind of indicators can we use for, let's say, monitoring the results? EPAF is very important because we are learning from EPAF that what we are measuring at IFAD in terms of, for instance, development is not something that can be, let's say, relevant for an indigenous communities. So what we are trying to do with the EPAF, and thanks to the EPAF, and thanks to FIMI, Tepteba, and Samburu Women Trust, as IFAD, we are learning that we need to change something when we work, and actually we need to change a lot, no? And use a different, let's say, glasses when we work with indigenous communities, no? The definition of what is poverty, what is development, what is well-being. Those are all questions that we are, let's say, questioning a lot thanks to the EPAF. Thank you, Jory, for the question. Feel free also to raise any other comments, not only about the EPAF, but also about also curiosity that you might have about the IFAD.
Margarita, so I have, oh, okay, let Anima go. Anima, please go ahead.
Hello, good evening. Thank you, Carla and Margarita, for the presentation. I was very, happy to hear that there are various ways to actually get help as an indigenous community. Get help, when I say it's like regarding the funding. However, I was just wondering, because indigenous community, they have a very small organization, and to begin with, it's kind of very difficult to understand the way the funding goes, the criteria that we have to fulfill. And I mean, I think for indigenous, it's just like very few organizations who meet the criteria. And small organization in many indigenous community, I think it's quite difficult for them to even apply or approach. So I think that's become a concern, because in that case, for those small organizations, they don't reach in that category even. Like it sounds very nice, but sometimes it's so difficult to even, go through that process. And I think you're getting what I'm trying to say. So, yeah.
Thank you, Anima. Actually, you have a beautiful name. In Italian, it means soul, Anima. So, yes,
you.
Anima, this is a very important question, because with the EPAF board and with the 3 partners, we've been discussing a lot about this, no? Because in some cases, it was like the only way for an indigenous people's community or a small organization to apply was to ask to another NGO to apply on their behalf. And okay, this might be good because if this is the only way, at least they have a way, but we also understand that we need, let's say it's a difficult balance, no? Because you have to balance between, of course, the importance to be able to fund initiatives also from small indigenous peoples organizations, which are really, let's say, working at grassroots level. And on the other side, of course, as IFAD, we have also some requirements, in terms of financial requirements, registration, legal registration, and so on. So we have to find, let's say, a good balance between the two dimensions. So what we are trying to do in this new call for proposal, we try to have a different, to enhance the rating and the system of technical review. And this means that with this new system, the IPAF board can decide, for instance, if, okay, we receive a very good proposal from a very small indigenous people's organization. So maybe the, let's say, the managerial capacity of the organization in terms of financial and so on, it's not really high, but the project seems to be very like interesting and very like relevant for the communities. The IPAF board can decide, for instance, to approve that project even if the, let's say, implementation capacity might be, let's say, difficult, but this is a risk that we can take, no? For instance, as IPAF and as IFAD. But we also have the case where indigenous peoples organizations that do not meet the requirement and they don't want, for instance, or they cannot, for a number of reasons, ask to an NGO to apply on their behalf. In this case, what we will try to do in this call for proposal is to work more with the 3 IPAF regional partners in terms of capacity development of small indigenous peoples organizations to make them, like to strengthen their capacity to submit the proposal, or also in terms of financial management, or how they can access not only IPAF, but also other funding mechanisms. So in this cycle, we will try to strengthen this, let's say, capacity development, let's say, implemented by the 3 regional partners for the smaller organizations. So this is what we are trying to do, but you raise a very important issue, which is at the very heart also on all the debate that we have now for the climate funding and how the small indigenous peoples communities and organizations can apply directly for the climate funding. Yeah, this is what we can say up to now. Thank you.
Anyone else? Margarita, while we wait for another participant to think of a question, this is not really related to the presentation, but overall work of IFAD. I come from Meghalaya, India, and I belong to the Khasi community, my state. And so I've been working in the health sector in my state with grassroots organization, and what I've seen in my state is we have these public healthcare facilities in the different districts of the state, and most of these healthcare facilities do not have biomedical waste management. So as per laws, I think my government has broken all the environmental rules of the state. So what happens is, for example, I was in the field last month and I noticed this healthcare facility which didn't have proper barricading and proper borders for the biomedical waste management. And what happens is that all of that liquid waste was, was opened to the agricultural land. So I don't know if, this obviously disrupts agricultural activities of the people. So I'm wondering if, your organization actually looks at all of this while funding projects as well, if there's any scope for biomedical waste management, and, if there's no biomedical, improper waste biomedical management hampers not just agricultural land, but also the social environment in that area. So I'm just wondering if, FAO and IFAD has any of these things in mind, and also how do you implement the stakeholder consultations in such areas?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Joy. I'm trying to reply, and then of course, Carla, if you want to add, IFAD adopted like an important document, which is this SECAP, which is a safeguard on social and not only social but also on environmental aspects, and we will share it with you. There is actually a revised version. And this is like a, let's say, an important document, even if quite complex also for us who work at IFAD, but it's a document that tries to make sure, starting from the design phase of a project, when IFAD start to design a project with the government, start to look at all the possible risk that the project might have, identify these environmental and social risk, and identify some measure to, let's say, mitigate at least the risk. And then based on this analysis, the project receive a rating, like category A, B, or C, depending on the risk. And based on this level of risk, we need to provide and to submit a very detailed project. For instance, if the project is rated as a high risk in terms of environment, this means that before the project is implemented and to be approved, the government and IFAD together have to identify specific measures. Otherwise, if not, the project cannot be approved. This is, for instance, for environmental risk, but it's the same for working in areas with indigenous peoples, which are home to indigenous peoples. If the project will be implemented in an area where are indigenous peoples, this means that a very deep analysis should be conducted on the way of life on indigenous peoples, and identify some of the risk in terms of land tenure, for instance, or land management, for instance. And this is like a criteria for the project to be approved or not. Okay, so this is like the SECAP needs, let's say, it's an instrument that helps the governments and IFAD to prevent this kind of risk, For instance, the one that you were like sharing and describing. So the SECAP, the safeguards represent like an important tools in this sense, in terms of risk and mitigation. I hope I replied to your question.
If I may add.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Joy. And to add to the part of the SECAP, and I think that was the other part of your question on the stakeholder engagement and the free, prior, and informed consent in case of indigenous peoples' territories, So we are also like pushing a lot to improve this participation of indigenous peoples, the active participation of the communities that are targeted in these projects, that they have a say in both the design, the implementation, the evaluation even of these projects, So I think this liaises very, very well with the topic of or why we came here to talk today and to hear from you, on what would be the role of your organizations, in these processes, and there is of course a window, where for you to participate, for you to engage, because it's the right of indigenous peoples, not only because there are procedures, but with a human rights-based approach, it is the right of indigenous peoples to be heard and to be involved. So these are like the means to materialize this. No, you have incidents through the SECAP, these procedures, we shared the link, the process of free, prior, and informed consent, and engaging in the stakeholder platforms. No, and of course, this is not a common practice yet because we're moving. No, we are starting to realize how, and I'm not talking about us at IFAD, but in general in the development arena, no, but to give protagonism to this engagement and the role of the communities, indigenous or not, in taking the decisions of their own development.
Thank you, Carla. I see, Doris, you mentioned something about Tepteba and the IFAD project. Maybe if you can just share here so that the translators can also interpret it for other participants.
Okay. Yes, because Tepteba is one of the regional partners for EPAF. So last year, we were able to make a video consolidation for the different projects that was handled here in the Asia Pacific region. So maybe one of the striking projects that I remember, because as part of the communications team, we were the ones who were consolidating the results. And so one of the projects that I really remember is one that was made in Nepal by Eco Himal, wherein they made improvements to their stove, their cooking stoves, because and because of that project, they were able to reduce the use of wood, and also to reduce the occurrences of different what do you call this, diseases, like diseases that was concerned with the lungs, so tuberculosis and all that. So it was also one of the striking projects aside from the many other projects that was done. So this one that I shared here in the chat is the video that was made aside from the all other videos that were made for each of the projects. So thank you.
Thank you, Doris. I'm just looking at the chat. I think there's a question from Pema too. Should I just read it for her? So, can grassroots organizations access IFAD grants in relation to the key issues focused by IFAD? If yes, how can we do that? Or if there are some specific process we can engage to access them? I think this was partly answered earlier.
Yes, maybe, Pema, yes, grassroots organization in relation to the EPAF, of course, grassroots indigenous organization can access the EPAF. EPAF is a grant, no? So in this case, yes, key issues focused by IFAD, yes, for instance, of course, in the focus and the team choose for each call for proposal is decided by the EPAF board, but of course is a team which is relevant for the IFAD mandate. So in this time, for the ongoing cycle, the emphasis is on climate adaptation and biodiversity management, because of course those are like the most important issues, no, and challenges we are facing at global level, but also because IFAD has a mandate to work on this topic. So if the question relates to the EPAF, of course, every time the EPAF board decide thematic issues, and the project approved should have a focus on this theme. We also have other grants. For instance, we have a grant with Slow Food, with the International Land Coalition and other organizations. And in this case, we don't have like a call for proposals, no? They are just like strategic partners. So IFAD can provide a direct grant to strategic partners, no, which are strategic for IFAD mandate. As I said, for instance, Slow Food or FIMI and others. I don't know if I replied to your question, Pema. If not, let us know so that we can be more specific. Thank you.
Any other questions, sisters? We still have a few more minutes before we can wrap up.
I don't know if Winnie has a question.
And I was the one who was asking. I just took over from Joy for a bit, but I was maybe this will be answered when you share the call for application, and we can see what the requirements are, what I mean, you know, what the standards are for applying. But I was just wondering, because now there are many organizations or foundations that are shifting to alternative ways of making applications and not necessarily filling out forms. And so I'm just wondering if IPAF has the same approach. Do we just, does an organization, grassroots or otherwise, have to fill out a form, or are there alternative ways of presenting applications within form of video or whatever other form that is available? And also the languages that you accept the applications in, because if the indigenous organizations that are housing the fund regionally, do they have that capacity of receiving applications in different languages? Especially, I know it might not be possible because of the very many languages that indigenous people speak, but yeah, just I'm just curious.
Thank you for your question, Winnie. This is another important challenges IPAF is trying to address, or facing and trying to address. Okay, on the question, if we are thinking about alternative ways, that will be amazing. And we always struggle with this, because we also think that the application form we know that it's quite long and really detailed, and we ask for many information, and it might be really like too much for an organization, not to spend time to reply to all the questions. So we will, of course, we are happy also to, if you have any other ideas or example that you want to share, if you know, for instance, about other organization system of application, that will be great and important for us to have other, let's say, examples, so that for the next call we can have like easier way, no, for submitting the application. And about the languages, same. Up to now, we are able to receive, because the three indigenous, our three IPAF partners, let's say that have, so far they have like human resources also to work on French, English, and Spanish. We know that Portuguese will be very important for Latin America, but so far we did, I mean, for this call for proposal, the three languages were English, French, and Spanish. But we will try for the next call for proposal to make sure that, as I said, Portuguese, or see how we can have also other languages accepted, no? Because if so, we have to make sure that the technical reviewers are able, of course, not to dive into the proposal. So this is another aspect that we are trying to address, the issue of the languages. So thank you, Winnie. And if you have ideas on how we can improve, please feel free. We will write in the chat our the email of the IPAF Secretariat so that you can yes, share your comments, and we are very happy. We will be very happy to receive your views. Thank you.
Carla, I don't know if you wanted to add anything. No? Okay, so Anima, I can see your hand up. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Do we still have time? So
yes.
Okay, thank you again. Well, I just want a small clarity. I was just trying to know if EPAF is only for agricultural assistance, but the full form says assistance facility. So I was just trying to know, because what happens is for the indigenous, it has been always a funding or a help or a grant. It comes like small livelihood, like chicken rearing or mushroom thing, or maybe goatery or something like that. But indigenous people never try to focus on something like education, which will be helpful to actually grow in for our generation in future, to be more equal to the whom we call like mainland people. So I just need clarity, because I wasn't sure about this. So if for education also, is it applicable for applying?
Yes, Anima. Actually, we will, if you have a look like at the IPAF website, there is a list of all the projects approved with a small summaries, no? And you can see that we really we've been funding very different projects, really covering different areas and so on. For instance, in this call for proposal, the focus was on climate adaptation, resilience, and biodiversity management, but you can look at this theme from different angles, no? Might be, let's say, in terms of land and resources or agriculture, but also like on knowledge sharing, traditional knowledge on climate and resilience. And this can be also like, embed, for instance, education activities like, I don't know, I'm thinking project with the schools about climate resilience, or training or workshop on biodiversity management and so on. So we are trying to be very, let's say, clear in the application form and in the call for proposal about example of project that might be funded. So together with the call for proposal, we also issue a guidelines for completing the application form where you can find example of project. It's not an exhaustive list, but at least to get some ideas on the activities that can be covered. So this is an information that cycle by cycle is changing. And but we try to be like clear at the time where we issue the call for proposal, to avoid that, of course, an organization spend a lot of time in working and developing a proposal which does not fit the proposal, the call for proposal. So thank you for your question.
We have a special guest also, surprise guest from our side that we wanted to introduce to you. And hello, this is Ilaria, our technical specialist here at IFAD.
Hi, hello everyone. I'm Ilaria Fiemian. I'm the senior technical specialist on indigenous peoples at IFAD. So I work in team with Carla and Margherita on all. I guess I came in. I'm sorry I couldn't join before because of other meetings, and but I could hear a bit of the of Margherita's I think she was responding to some questions. And I think this is a great initiative, really. It's very like exciting to see this leadership training and this leadership work. It's very important, I think, and it's also good. I just wanted to also show our team of women, our team of women leaders, and yeah, just to say hi, and yeah, for the little thing I could hear so far, I'm very, I think the discussion was interesting and went on quite focused. But yeah, I'm also there if you have any specific question. I mean, now I can join, but there's nothing I can answer that Carla Margarita cannot. So just there.
If you are there for the permanent forum, maybe, and you see Ila, you just tell her that you were in the leadership school, so you can connect as well. You will recognize her.
And thank you again. I mean, it's a great initiative. I know it's not the first year, and I'm very glad that we were. I mean, that you thought of IFAD again for supporting. We will always. I mean, we'll be happy to continue supporting this initiative also in other forums or other type of events or sessions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming to say hello to us. And ladies, if you go to the permanent forum, you will see an IFAD name badge where the UN bodies usually sit. So I'm assuming that's where you will see her sitting. So please feel free to approach her if you're at the permanent forum. Thank you for the invitation to also meet with some of us at the permanent forum for those who will attend. Thank you for the invitation, and I hope that some of you, whoever is able to travel will be able to meet you in person. Thank you so much, and also thank you, IFAD, for always for accepting the invitation from the Global Leadership School. It means a lot, and for the programs that you're having with Indigenous peoples and uplifting the lives of Indigenous peoples in their own communities through the EPAF, and also just having space for Indigenous peoples at IFAD. That for us is one of the good practices that we've seen with IFAD, where there's space for Indigenous peoples to come and convene and give their opinions and share their priorities within the work that IFAD does, and to see it materialize into something that can, into funding that goes directly to Indigenous peoples organizations. That is a good practice, and we appreciate it very much. But we also appreciate that you have the time to come and speak to these leaders, the women leaders who also go back to their communities, who see things happening in their communities, who are making change and impact in their own communities, and they can have opportunity to also engage IFAD and IPAF in their own regions, because now they know the organizations that they can approach. They know the people that they can speak to get more information about how to engage further with IFAD and IPAF. So thank you so much again for that. We have a few minutes left, so that if there's one last question or one last comment, we can do that before I pass it back to Joy. Anyone? All right, so in case there's no one, maybe I can hand it back to Margarita and Carla for you to give any closing remarks that you have before we can call it a day. Thank you.
Because I saw Carmen Gomez, who unmuted herself. I don't know, maybe Carmen wanted to say something.
This is Carmen Gomez. I'm one of the interpreters. So,
okay,
hello,
great.
And it's been a very interesting session to interpret. That's all I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, from my side, it's a very, very big thanks and the gratitude for inviting us, for being here together today, sharing. I take from the questions a lot of concepts, a lot of things to keep working on. It's inspiration for us to keep doing our work and doing it with a lot of passion, and hope we will meet with you soon in person. I give it also to Marge for her final words.
Yes, thank you very much. We really felt like this was an important space for us. It's not common also for us to have this kind of spaces. As Winnie was saying, that at IFAD we have the forum, which is a space of discussion, but at the same time, it's like if for us, this is a forum in a different ways, because we are here and we can really listen to all your voices here. So if you want in other initiatives, we will be very happy to join, even if in a listening mode, just to have the opportunity and chance to be part of this network. And thank you very much for the work you are doing. Yes, thank you really for the invitation, and good luck for everything.
Thank you so much, Carla and Margarita, for always coming back to the school. I remember that we had you in last year's edition as well, and that was also very enriching. So it's really great to keep having our networks coming and supporting us throughout all our editions. We hope that we will be able to meet you in person. Unfortunately, this year, the participants of the school will not be going to New York for the permanent forum because there have been some issues with visa applications. But we hope to meet you one day soon in person. And with that, we would like to present to you a certificate of appreciation from me. We will just put it up on the screen. Yes, to Carla. For participation and contribution in the capacity building of Indigenous women leaders from Africa, Asia, Latin America, North America, and the Pacific during the 10th edition of the Program on Human Rights and International Advocacy Skills. And this has been signed by the Executive Director of FIMI, Teresa Zapeta. And we also have one for Margarita. For Margarita too, thank you for being with us and for your participation and contribution in the capacity building of Indigenous women leaders from Asia, Africa, Latin America, North America, and the Pacific for today's session during the 10th edition of the Program on Human Rights and International Advocacy Skills. Thank you so much, Carla, Margarita, and I'm sorry I missed the other sister's name who's joining us from IFAD, but thank you for coming and saying hi, and all the best. We wish you all the very best, and we hope to continue working with IFAD.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Joy. Thanks.
Sisters, I just have one short announcement for the 15th of March, which is a session day after tomorrow. So you must have seen in your calendars that on the 15th of March, our session will end 30 minutes later, which is at 10:30 p.m. Guatemala time. We will begin at 8 p.m., but we will end at 10:30 p.m. And not 10 p.m. on the 15th of March. And we will be having the special rapporteur joining us for this session. So I request you to please be there on time on that particular day. And also please switch on your cameras for that session. So yes, so that's all. And we close now and we'll see you on Wednesday. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day and good evening, good night, and see you soon.
Bye, everyone. See you soon.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.